Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Wisdom to Wealth. With me today is a very special guest coming all the way from Australia. Are you in Australia right now, Graham?
I am.
Okay, sometimes he's in the Solomon Islands or Dubai or other places, so I want to double check. We have a very special guest, Graham Daniels. I had the pleasure to meet his father and him a couple years ago. They have been mentoring people who want to do great things in business for several years. And to tell you a little bit about Graham, Graham has a very extensive background in international business, precious metals, law, real estate, and ancient Hebrew studies. And Graham possesses a very unique blend of skill sets that place him in high demand for private consultations and as a convention speaker. So you guys are going to be very blessed, very entertained. I encourage you to take notes during our episode today because we have a very special guest. Graham, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. Good to be there.
Thank you so much. I love your map you have behind you. If you don't mind sharing, I know this is a little off the cuff. Over to your right, it looks like an upside down pyramid. It almost looks like it has a family crest on the top. Is that something related to family? Yeah, what is that up there? That's very interesting.
It's actually a trophy, a shield, a trophy that we played for in polo. We ran a club for a number of years, and that was one of the trophies people played for.
Mm-hmm.
The Australian Light Horse Shield, you may not be aware, but the Australian Light Horse was probably the last great cavalry charge in world history when they broke through the Gaza to Beersheba line in the Middle East in World War I and marched on into Jerusalem. It's quite a historical event that freed Jerusalem from many centuries of Muslim control. So, yeah, it was a very significant event.
Well, that's fascinating. I was just reading about the Sheikh of Dubai, how he has a lot of horses. And that's very fascinating about the Australian Light Horse. Thank you for sharing that, Graham.
You're welcome.
So, Graham, I wanted to cover a few key things with you today. One thing that I really related to as I watched several interviews with your father and then invested in the Destiny of the Third Millennium course is there's a lot of commonalities of my family background and your family background previous to your father, the multiple generations of having government assistance and, as Solomon would say, perishing for lack of knowledge, and how your father went on that journey of learning to read at work and being mentored by a man. And so I just wanted to ask you, my family, I'm actually descended from John Adams and John Quincy Adams, the second and fifth presidents of the United States. But as a kid, I didn't know that. All I knew is that my mom's family was very messed up, and I did not want to be like them. So I wanted to ask you, your father overcame 3 generations of family poverty and, in a lack of education to become successful. I want to ask you, what was your experience growing up? Did you see a lot of transformation when you were very young as he was going through that journey? I'd love to hear your perspective as a second generation of your family being successful.
Yeah. Look, it was probably more than 3 generations of poverty that my father came from. As far back as we can trace, we were probably brought out to Australia even as convicts from England. But that put aside, growing up in the family home, I guess I didn't know any different. What I saw is what was the experience of the time. I do recall quite clearly that times when my parents had very little and things were a struggle. I was only a very young lad, one of 3 children. I've got an older brother and a younger sister. And so I do have a sensitivity to those who struggle and come from a background of the do-not-haves. But nonetheless, with what we did have, which wasn't much, there was always a family unity. There was always a concern for the integrity of family. And, you wonder sometimes where that comes from with the background my father particularly had with broken marriages on his mother's side with multiple partners and violence and jail terms and police and drunkenness and so on. But growing up, for me, it was just normal. And to see what we didn't have at one time, I can remember heading off to school as a young boy to primary school, I probably would have only been about 7 or 8. And every morning before we left to walk to school, Mum would pray with us. And it was always a family tradition that Mum would pray with us before we were sent off. That morning she said, "What would you like for tea?" And being kids, we just, let's have some sausages. Well, we prayed with Mum that morning. We went off to school, and when we came home that night, sausages were on the table. Little did I know there was nothing in the cupboard that morning when we went to school. Wow. There was no money in Mum's purse. And so we saw events like that helped solidify the reality of an awesome, powerful God. And some people would accept that, some would not, but I've seen it firsthand. Mm-hmm. And so, I've experienced the life of not having, but I've also experienced the life of having. And I think that's put me in a very unique position, and a position that I don't take lightly, but I really enjoy it because I can basically talk to anyone along the ladder of success. And as my dad always taught me, he said, be very kind to the people you meet when you climb the ladder of success, because it's the same people you'll meet on the way back down.
Right. Yeah, I was really struck by, I actually shared this with my audience a few weeks ago, that there are 2 German billionaires that committed suicide in the last decade. One of them was worth like 11.5 billion, and he went down to about 7. He had several business deals go bad all within the course of a year, and threw himself in front of a train in Germany. And another gentleman was a German-American billionaire, pioneered putting sunroofs into cars that did not have them from the manufacturer. And he and his son both struggled with depression, and he donated like $150 million to the University of Michigan to study depression, but he ended up taking his own life. And you pointed out a very important thing, Graham, is that we need to have a greater purpose than just financial and business achievement, because long term those won't fulfill us, just as Solomon talked about in Ecclesiastes at the end of his life. So,
look, I think people commit suicide that don't have, and people commit suicide that do have. And depression is a major concern, particularly in our modern society. Here in Australia, for example, we have the highest teenage male suicide rate in the world.
Wow.
And that's staggering, coming from a country that's considered the lucky country. And you've got to start asking questions why that is. And I know there are a number of scenarios where people, for one reason or another, could find themselves in a position where suicide is an attractive option. I've met people like that. I've lost friends that have hit that wall, and I guess everyone's got their breaking point. But the solution is not money, and it's not the lack of money. There needs to be, as you say, something more deeper, something more meaningful. It's been said that the 2 most important days in our lives are 1, the day we were born, and 2, the day we discover why. And I think that many people don't really have that focal point, that reference point, that stability or foundation. And when they do hit the wall, we see some sad things happening.
Right.
And I don't think it's going to stop. But money's not the answer to it, and it's not the cause of it.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of greater purpose and your why, I oftentimes, whether I'm speaking to a multi-billionaire or a homeless person on the street in the Philippines, there's a family that I'm putting the eldest daughter through college. They sleep on the sidewalk in my wife's hometown in the Philippines. They live on like about $2.50 to $3 a day. And that basically feeds the children, and there's not much else to have money for. It's I always think about what's driving you and why do we do what we do. And one of the most empowering things that I learned from your family, Graham, is the strategy to plan 4 and 5 generations ahead. Most Americans don't think that far ahead. I'm not sure about Australians, but most Americans don't think that far ahead. If you have a publicly traded company like Amazon or whatever, they're thinking about the next quarter. I think it's really important to think multi-generationally. And if you look at Jewish people, they look all the way back to Father Abraham. And I think amongst more secular societies like Japan, they like to plan about 100 years ahead for a company. So I think that we can learn a lot of wisdom from looking at the Jewish model and thinking multi-generationally. And also when you think ahead, applying next level strategy to ensuring our family can be successful, not just financially, but in other ways for multiple generations, learning from the past generations. I wanted to ask you, you're of the second generation, if you would, of your family being successful and you have your own children. How often does your family discuss plans that you've laid out? And how do you empower your children to explore their own interests and still carry on the family success? Because I know in a lot of families there can be a little bit of conflict that comes there if there's not good planning and communication between the generations.
Yeah. Well, that's a big question. I think, first of all, we've got to define success for what it is. Mm-hmm. And if we say success is discovering a target, aiming for it and hitting it, if that's how we measure success, then that can apply to money, but it can also apply to any avenue of life. Mm-hmm. And so as far as success is concerned, we've got to focus on what is important. And for me, that target is family. In my lectures, if you've ever heard any of them, you would know that I often use the phrase, as the family goes, so goes the nation. And I'm very much in favour of the principle that the family is the building block of society. And if the family crumbles, yes, the nation will crumble. If the family is a strong unit, and there's many of them, yes, the nation will be a success. So to me, the focus of success in my life is family. Sure, there's other trimmings that we need and we enjoy as we go through life's journey. But if I had amassed enormous assets and lost my family, to me, I'd be a failure. Right. If I had a successful family and a close family and no assets, I would be a success. And so it gets back to what you're aiming at. I think so many people do aim for assets, and there's nothing wrong with assets. But I think we need to have a balance in life. And those who aim just for assets, David, that's all they've got. They've got nothing else. And sure, family will fall apart. You will not have a generation, maybe 2 generations down the track. Because if it's only assets, they come and go. The key to this is teaching principles, not necessarily having a weekly meeting where all the family get together and they look at their agenda and how they're going to progress asset base or they're going to progress market share. That's not where I'm at. Mm-hmm. And so for me, you teach principles. And principles are enduring beyond a generation. And not only teaching people principles or teaching your children and friends principles, teaching them why. We've got to know why we believe what we believe. And that's what's lacking today. Many people know what they believe, but when you dig a bit deeper, they have no substance or reasoning as to why they believe it. Mm-hmm. And the same thing applies to principles. If you give your family principles to live by, number one, you've got to live by them yourself. If you don't live by them yourself, then we've often heard the phrase, actions speak louder than words. And sometimes our actions are so loud that our kids can't hear the words we're saying. We've got to be able to demonstrate in what we're doing, then we can talk about it. And quite often when the kids see what you're doing, the conversation will start. And so it's really a basic understanding of teaching principles and then encouraging children to be their own identity. We don't need 2 David Newbys in this world. We don't need 2 Graham Daniels. What we do need are our offspring as individuals with their own dreams, their own individual fingerprints, their own individual emotional prints, their own individual intellectual prints. This is what we need. And I encourage my kids to follow their own dream. But here's your bag full of principles that will help you no matter which direction you tend to take in life. Right. And to go 4 or 5 generations deep is not that difficult. You mentioned I'm second. My kids are third. My sister's kids are third. Her kids have already had a child. So there's 4 generations and we're all alive at once. Right. So teaching principles is the answer here. It's not a matter of a board meeting of the family and a checkpoint and a questionnaire and a productivity statement. Not necessary. You live the life. They see that you live the life. They see that your actions speak louder than words, but you reinforce it with words and you explain to them why you believe what you believe. And if you can't explain why you believe what you believe, you've got to question why you're actually believing it yourself.
Yeah, those are powerful distinctions. I grew up living in 6 different United States, and then I spent a summer in the Philippines as a missionary when I turned 10 years old. And
Wow.
Meeting a lot of people in different parts of the country, I am outgoing. I became more outgoing. And I would often ask people, what do you like to do? What are you into? And I'm very fascinated by people's belief systems. I would ask them, if they say I'm Catholic, I'm Muslim, I'm Seventh-day Adventist, whatever they are, I'd be like, oh, that's really neat. Like, tell me about that. And then I would ask them, why do you believe that? Almost everyone would just tell me, because that's what my parents believe. It seemed
That's
like
right.
5 out of 100 said, well, I've done my research and I've decided that I want to live this way. And I'm like, if we truly have a soul and there really is something beyond our life, if our soul goes somewhere after we're physically dead, this would be wise to do a little more study. So I agree with you 100%. Knowing why we believe what we believe is so key, and we should be willing to ask ourselves those questions, because then our kids will believe our conviction a lot more about why we believe in. And I think if we know why we believe what we believe, there will be a more consistency of actions that our kids will be more willing to follow. Related to that,
David, it becomes their property. If they know why they believe what they believe, it becomes their property. And they can stand up in discussion, whether they're a teenager in school and kids raise issues about sexuality or about value systems. If they understand why they believe what they believe and it's their own possession, they're able to debate it with intelligence. Mm-hmm. And that's what's missing today in so many circles. We rely so much on tradition without questioning it. And quite frankly, I think some of our traditions have led us astray.
Yeah, I think asking why is always a good thing. If our desire is not to just doubt, but to go deeper in understanding. Related to passing on values and knowing why we believe what we believe, Graham, I found it's very fascinating. Many billionaires' families fall apart because of the wealth. Like you said, there's too much focus on the assets and not the relationships and the values, and it decimates the family. And so I've noticed in talking to several other second-generation people of families with multiple assets that a lack of affirming, like if they don't have their own affirmation and their own groundedness in who they are, that oftentimes they don't want to do much with their parent that controls the money. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think that parents watching this can best shape their kids' identity and helping them get really grounded in knowing why we believe what we believe and feeling confident as their own person? And still, you can still honor the family, but be your own person.
Yeah. Look, I think, again, it gets back to the individual's fingerprints. I know in my case, when I travelled with my father extensively around the world and we lectured, inevitably my father was very well known, very well respected, particularly in Christian church circles. And people used to come to me and they'd say, wow, your father's amazing. How are you ever going to walk in his footsteps? And my answer was always the same. I don't intend to. They're his footsteps. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to recognise that. We all have our own direction in life, our own passions, our own dreams that we want to explore. Mm-hmm. And I say to people, if you knew you could not fail, what plans would you have on the drawing board today? What would you be doing if you knew you couldn't fail? And once they discover what it is that they would be doing if they knew they couldn't fail, I encourage them to do it. I don't want my children to walk in my footsteps. They're my footsteps. But I want them to follow their passions and their dreams. And they're quite different to mine, as mine is to my father's. Mm-hmm. And so I think by not trying to put a round peg in a square hole, by trying to clone your children to be replicas of you with your desires and your dreams and your asset base and your value system, again, teach them why they believe what they believe, and then allow them to develop their own personality in whatever shape or form it might take. And that way we don't have the problem of trying to deal with conflicts that shouldn't be there to start with. We need to be compatible, not competitive. And I think that's the main problem we experience in marriages today. society has tended to make man and woman competitive in a marriage relationship, and they were never designed to be competitive. They were designed to be compatible. And I think the same principle applies with raising children. Don't try and be competitive with them. Be compatible. If your son or daughter wants to go in a particular direction, encourage them. And you'll find that even in their youth, in their younger days, by finding what their passions are, you'll help them achieve the best them they can be. I'll give you an example. My son, when he was a young lad, had a number of problems. He had dyslexia, he had cross-eyed, he had food allergies, had a number of issues. We took him out of school and homeschooled him. He had real difficult reading. He would read words back to front and so on. And so we had the normal curriculum that we had at school, and we thought that might be useful, but we were wrong. I couldn't get him to read until I discovered his passion. And one of his passions was motorbike racing. So we bought him a dirt bike as a young lad, got him a trainer to train him on dirt bike racing, and before long he was reading motorbike magazines. And so although we couldn't get him to fit into a square hole because he was a round peg, it doesn't mean you can't work on his passions in order to help him progress in areas he needs to develop. So today he would read more than me. And this is from a kid that couldn't read, had physical problems that prohibited him from reading effectively, had no interest in traditional school. And now he'll quote books and e-books, he'll be riding his horses and he'll have podcasts in his ears. He's a very intelligent, well-read young man. And so by finding what their hot button is, what turns them on, what gets them going, and dangle that carrot in front of them as a young child, you'll help them develop in areas they need to develop in. But to try and get him to read a standard school book, wasting your time, absolutely wasting your time. And so even with my daughter, when she was in high school, you call it college, she came to me one day and she said, "Dad, I'm looking at the girls that are 2 years beyond me, and they're working in checkout chicks in the supermarket, running the groceries, working the cash register." She said, "I don't want to be where they are. I want to leave school." And I said, "Tali, I've got no problem with you leaving school as long as you've got a plan." And she said, "I have got a plan." She told me her plan. I said, "Well, you can leave any time you like." And so she got out of the school system. And she today works with me in business, travels the world with me, and she is a very competent young woman. So once you find that hot button and you can encourage them to be the best them that they can be, don't feel like they have to be clones of David Newby or Graham Daniels.
Yeah, those are great distinctions. I've talked with my 19-year-old son about you don't have to do what you see all your friends doing, because you are an individual, and if you want to go spend a year in the Philippines or other places, I'm encouraging them actually before jumping into school and pursuing the American dream, as they call it, and buying a bunch of stuff and having to pay it off. It's like, my son's a really good saver. So I'm like, hey, save your money while you're in college. If you have a few grand saved up, go travel for 6 months and just get life experience that helps you appreciate of what we have in these first world countries that much more. And I'm encouraging my younger son. He's very, very Filipino in his mannerisms. My wife's from the Philippines. I'm encouraging him like, hey, maybe go to the Philippines in college for a year or two, and you'll really appreciate what we have that much more, and appreciate the Filipino part of our culture, not just visiting our in-laws for a few weeks at a time at holidays, but living there. It's a different experience. Me living there just for 3 months, Graham, was very, it just expanded my worldview, and I appreciated what we have in America, because I complained about being poor in America, and after living in the poorest barrio in Manila, I realized I'm rich. And I never complained about being on welfare when my mom finished nursing school anymore. So, and related to that with your children, and your daughter decided to join you in working in the business. Graham, one thing that's interesting to me is how different families get their children involved in their family business. Some families, the kids feel forced or very obligated to. Other families do it in a much more affirming way, affirming who they are, which it sounds like the way that you did it. Some families even make their kids work for another company before they're allowed to work in the family business, so that they get treated like a regular employee and they don't take things for granted. They call it the nepotism, or I forgot the exact
Yeah.
other word for that. What do you think are the keys to passing on to values to your children, specific to being a good steward of assets and appreciating whatever business they work in, so that they wisely manage things and that they don't just feel, what's the word, obligated, or like things should be given to them? What do you think are the best keys to helping them really appreciate what you pass on to them?
Well, I think it comes back to family again, David. I mean, to me, that's where it all stems from. And so that the principles that my wife and I lived by and the kids saw in our practice, they adopted them, and where they felt need to challenge them, they'd challenge us on them, and we'd explain the why we believe what we believe principle. And I'd encourage debate. And so we would often have, and when we had our country property where we raised our children, we had a massive timber dining room table that we ate our meals around. And quite often the kids would bring their teenage kids over for a barbecue or whatever, and we'd sit around and have meaningful discussions. And I encourage the discussions, because if we can't intellectually and logically and meaningfully explain principles of life and be prepared to be challenged on them, we've got to question whether we're up the right path or not. And so these were normal discussions. And so working in a vocation and the children wanting to be part of what I was doing in their own way, it was just a natural progression. I remember a turning point in my daughter's life when she'd left school and she'd gone to the Conservatorium of Music and studied music and was very strong on her horses at the same time. She had a gap there of a few weeks where there's not much happening, and I was heading off to Europe to do some business. And I said to my wife, Leanne, I said, why don't we see if Tali wants to come with me? Mm-hmm. And we said, Tali, I'm going to go to Europe, do some business. You're welcome to come. I'll have meetings that I have to go to. You can either suit up and come to the meetings with me and sit there and just observe, or you can go shopping. Well, that's a no-brainer for a teenage girl. And so she said, yeah, I'll go. So what we did was we went to Europe, and Tali was following a gospel singer in America. And she said, look, I'd like to go and see one of his concerts. Now, this is a black American gospel singer, but really good. And I said, okay, let's do it. Let's do it around the world. So we went off to Europe. I went to my business meetings. She went shopping. We went to England, visited some of her friends. We went around the other side of the planet and popped up in New York and had the hot dog in New York, and then went to Las Vegas and took in a show and went to this gospel concert where Tali and I were the only two white people in the whole building. It was a brilliant performance. And that sort of thing just built such a bond and a relationship that you cannot teach. You have to experience. And when Tali saw the sort of things I was involved with firsthand, because she got to meet some of the business people that I mingled with, it was from that point she said, you know what, I think I would like to do something with you. And so we worked together. And even when I had staff, when we ran different styles of businesses, I never ever said that these people worked for me. I always said they worked with me. Mm-hmm. And that's the difference in the relationship. So even with family, it was, yeah, let's work together on this. And, okay, I have my principles of how I like business to be run and my techniques and my formats. And as I said to Tali when she came to work with me, I said, now listen, this is how I do it. Let me explain it. And I've set out how I run the program. I said, now you don't have to follow what I'm doing. You can do it your way as long as your way is better than my way. And so I gave her the liberty to examine it herself. Now, is Talia's way of doing this better than mine? If it is, let's do it. If it's not, then stick with mine. And so it was a situation of working with, not working for. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important. And it's often missing today, not just in business relationships, but in family relationships. And I've seen parents tell their kids, you will do it because I said so. Well, David, that doesn't work.
Right.
I've seen it happen in religious circles where pastors would talk to their children like that. You will do it because I said so. Well, expect rebellion because you've just invited it.
Right.
So work with them.
Disaffirming them when you don't give them freedom to explore and learn.
Correct. And let's face it, as long as our eye is on the target, what we're trying to achieve, I don't care if it's my way or your way or someone else's way, as long as we achieve the target and maintain integrity in doing so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great distinction, Graham, because to me, in my last book, Beyond Billions, I talked about the power of having an affirmation ceremony for your children. And I think if you look over history, many cultures had rites of passage or affirmation ceremonies. Most Americans are most familiar with the bar mitzvah. In Africa, the Maasai tribes still do rites of passages where the young men go and kill a lion. American Indian tribes have done it. They did it in ancient Rome, Greece. There are many tribes in the Philippines and other countries, maybe even in New Zealand or parts of Australia, still have rites of passages. So I think it's really important to have a moment where you affirm the manhood of a son or the woman of a daughter. And I think ongoing what you just said, Graham, it's a way of affirming their wisdom in that here's how we do things, this works. And by all means, innovate and look for ways to do it even better. It's like you're entrusting to them to innovate, and that's how business innovation has come, by people having the freedom to improve things. And I live in Dearborn, Michigan. It's where Ford Motor Company was founded and where the world headquarters still is at. The Ford versus Ferrari movie just came out. I actually went and watched that with my younger son because he's very into movies, and I'm encouraging him, explore all the different ways you might be able to work in the movie industry. But one of the biggest challenges Henry Ford had was he really struggled to affirm his son and was too critical of his son. And his son was actually a very good manager, but he never made his son feel that he was doing good. And so that really created friction in the family, I think, needlessly. And, that's a real cost when you have tens and tens of thousands of employees working for you. Mistakes that someone in the family might make could literally cause thousands of people to lose their job. And so I really appreciate you pointing that out, Graham, that we can always teach a child a best practice and still affirm them and give them freedom to improve things. That's a very, very powerful principle. Related to that, a business will just be one part of an inheritance. I did go through the Way I See It course, which I would encourage everyone watching this to invest in. It's worth its weight in gold. In one of the trainings there, you talked about trust and as part of an inheritance. And you talked about using trust to leave an inheritance to your children's children. And, what things does your family do to not only pass on, tangible assets, but also the knowledge to manage them well? Because you talked about values and principles and how you create a discussion in the family. How do you pass on those kind of specific knowledge bases to manage gold holdings, real estate holdings, whatever the asset might be? How did you, as your family, how do you guys do that?
Yeah. Look, again, it just comes back to the principles that you instill in your family. I've got a video that's coming out probably in January on asset protection. And there's comments made from maybe 15, 20 people around the world, different walks of life, in relation to how I've helped them with various asset protection and so on. My daughter actually comments on that video as well. And her comment on it is simply along the lines of, the things that my dad teaches in seminars and in board meetings is what we learn around the dinner table at home. And I think that's probably the key. I mean, there's no secrets in all this. What is relevant and what works and what's truth is what's important. And it's the same principles that are taught around the home that is taught in business. And so my kids understand these principles. And to hand on to the next generation a book of principles, in some respects is not valid. Because if it's in a book and it's not in them, then it's not of value. If it's in them, it doesn't need to be in a book. And so the very principles are the things that we discuss on a daily basis. My children will ring me from anywhere around the world because they both travel. My daughter lived in Thailand for 3 years. My son travels the world extensively. I travel. And I'll always take a phone call from the kids. Even if the phone rings now in our discussion, if it's my children, I'll be quietly texting them to see if everything's all right, or if they need me, and I'll just let them know that I'm in a meeting. If it's important, I'll go outside and take it. If it's not, I'll talk to them straight after. To let them know they have that priority in my life is so valuable. And so they will be more inclined to listen to what else I've got to say. I've taken phone calls at 2 o'clock in the morning from my teenage son who's been out hunting at night and been stopped by the police. They go, "Dad, the cops have pulled me over. Where are you? I'll be straight there, don't move." Morning before last, I got a 3:30 text from my daughter in the morning. Her warm blood horse had just had a foal. I replied back. To know that you're always there. It's called the "here I am, Father" principle. I think it's such a basic principle that dads today don't realise. And so when you are that available to your kids, yes, they'll listen to your principles. And when they listen to your principles and they become their possession, then they're automatically going to live them and teach them to the next generation. It's really that simple. I don't know how else to put it, because to me it's just a natural flowing of family relationships in a functional way.
So, can I go a little deeper on this point? So, for example, me growing up on welfare, I had a lot of poverty consciousness, and as I started to make more money in business, sometimes I felt a little uncomfortable with the money. And my mom, I asked her for a pair of Air Jordans in second grade. That was the first year that we went on to welfare when she first went into nursing school. And we were living on $503 a month. And I asked her for a pair of $120 tennis shoes. She sat down and did the budget with me for 2 months, and I actually wrote out all the checks. So then I learned about budgeting, how much came in, how much went out, and I didn't ask for the Air Jordans anymore because I understood the reality of our budget. In some families, whether they're poor or have a lot of assets, there's a feeling that it's not polite to talk about money, or this is an adult conversation, we don't talk about it with the kids. A lot of people families have limiting beliefs that maybe they got from their parents. So what I find works for me really well, Graham, is just to almost schedule a time to talk about different things. If I schedule it, it happens. So how did you and your wife do it? Did you schedule it, or just have certain times that you would talk about, here's what's going on and what we're doing to manage it? Like, what did that look like on a weekly basis, a monthly basis? And how did it get into the conversations?
I can remember the first time my son worked out what a credit card was. He was being homeschooled, he was a young lad, and he got a remote control motorised car, one of those little cars that are quite fast in the remote control. Uh-huh. And he was on the phone one day. I didn't know he was on the phone, but he was on the phone, he put his hand over, he said, "Dad, what's a credit card?" I said, "Why do you want to know?" He said, "I've got someone on the phone. What's a credit card? I need to get something." I said, "Mate, what are you talking about?" And he said, "I've got someone in Sydney," and he's in Adelaide, my son's in Adelaide, "I've got someone in Sydney that's going to send me the spare parts for my car that's just broken, and I need a credit card." Well, that was a normal transition of growth. I mean, he'd worked out that his car had broken, he needed a part, he found someone that would supply it, he rang them, and they said, "I'll post you the part as long as you can pay for it now on the credit card." It just becomes part of everyday life, David. It's not like a scheduling, "I'm now going to teach you about money." But when these subjects arise, that's the perfect time to deal with them. Don't try and deal with them when they don't arise, right? Because they won't. You're talking to deaf ears. I can, and I'm sort of using family examples because they're real and I know the truth of them. I can remember my son as a teenager trucking a load of horses from Sydney up to Brisbane, and he's in the truck with his mates, and he rings me one day, said, "Dad, what's the story with homosexuality?" And here he is sitting in the truck on loudspeaker with some of his rough mates, and he wants to know what the principles are relating to homosexuality. And so I'm able to raise that subject and talk about it because I've been invited to. And now I've got a pair of ears and I've got a heart that's listening. And any subject, don't try and force it. Let it happen. I know that my children often had pastors' sons from one of the churches we attended come around our house because they could ride the motorbikes, they could go shooting the firearms, they could do what they wanted to do in a controlled and safe environment. And they'd often stay for meals. And some of the subjects that came up at mealtime were absolutely earth-shattering. You would never be able to plan it. But by creating an environment where, okay, any questions allowed, any conversations allowed, and let's talk about it openly, hey, some of the stuff we talked about would have made some of the pastors' hair stand on end. But we needed to. And occasionally I would bait them. And I'd ask questions like, drugs. what's the story with marijuana? And some of the pastors' kids would say, oh, you can't have that. That's not right. It's bad. You can't have marijuana. And I'd say, well, tell me something. Was it in the Garden of Eden when God created it? They'd say, oh, I guess it was. And didn't God say that everything he created was good? Mm-hmm. Oh, I guess it was. And you as a pastor's son is trying to tell me that it's bad? And straight away you'd open up a gambit of conversation that would lead into so many other areas. And so, look, conversation was natural, but if it wasn't going anywhere, I'd always drop a question. And the question then would steer it in an area where it was meaningful.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's smart you've let it be led by your children in life situations. My sons are 19 and 15 right now, and I have a friend who 5 months ago was shot when his first baby was on the way. It was on a holiday weekend, Memorial Day weekend, and someone just shot him. And
Wow.
it just really, we all know it intellectually that tomorrow is not promised to any of us, but when it happens to someone close to us, we feel it. The reality becomes more emotionally visceral for us. And so I told my sons that every quarter I want to ask them, what's going on in your life? What would you like to learn about? And I can really help teach you about things that you're interested in. And it was interesting because they both told me, they're like, well, we want to know more about investing and business. So we get together, just the three of us without my wife, about once a week, sort of like guys' time. And we'll goof off and have fun. And then I'll teach them some different things about investing and business. But it was interesting because they told me they wanted to learn about it.
Okay.
It wasn't me trying to shove it down their throat. Like, you need to know this, 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 and this, and this. So
that's the perfect environment and platform to start to educate when people want to learn. But you raised a question, I only dealt with part of the answer in relation to principles and holding assets and trusts. Mm-hmm. And I think as far as transferring assets to the next generation, if we're talking about tangible assets, then trust plays a role. If we're talking about value systems, then it's ordinary discussion like we've just explained. Mm-hmm. But as far as holding tangible assets and transferring them to the next generation, I'm very much a advocate for holding assets in trust. It does a number of things. One, you can see your will in action before you're actually dead, and you can see if there's any complications or anything that needs to be fine-tuned, because ultimately, in establishing an asset-holding trust where the beneficiaries are those that are close to you, like family members, you can start to see how the interplay between family members is going to play out. Very important. When you're dead, you can't see that. And the other benefit is simply that holding assets in trusts secures them from creditors. And I'm a strong believer that we need to be able to isolate family assets from what we do in business. If we make a mistake in business, then bad luck, we've got to pay for that. We've got to show integrity and be responsible for our actions. But there's no reason why family assets should suffer because of a bad decision you or I make. And so I like to hold assets in trust, and that way they're isolated from business activity and from my own personal ownership. And it means then that they're assets that can be enjoyed by the family even if I make a bad decision and go bankrupt. And to be able to transfer assets to the next generation because they're held in trust is a valuable thing. And America has basically inherited the trust law from England, as has Australia and Ceylon and South Africa and Canada and New Zealand and Singapore and Hong Kong. So many of the common law countries have trust law. Right. Not that trust law is necessarily relevant. And I actually say that if we look back in history, ancient Hebrew culture had trust law. The Ark of the Covenant was held in trust. It was for the benefit of the children of Israel. The assets of the Sinai tablets were held in the Ark. And so the concept of trust law perpetuating generation to generation is well established, and particularly since it's been entrenched in British law since 1300. So Americans should use that. They should use it to their benefit. And if trust law in America gets to the stage where it becomes unattractive, then I see no detriment in people setting up trusts outside of America in a favourable jurisdiction in order to hold their assets. The key word here is diversification. Diversifying in, number one, what assets you're holding. Number two, what vehicles you hold them in, whether it's a foundation or a trust or personally or a company. And three, what countries you hold them in. And they're the three relevant diversification principles that I encourage people to consider. And there's some great advantages in holding assets in trust. So I think it's something people should consider.
Yeah, definitely. I spent one summer in Alaska and a summer in the Philippines, and just Alaska's still America, but it didn't feel like it. It was, still close to Russia there. It was fascinating to me. Those two things helped me think more globally. And it's amazing how many people never go more than 100 miles from where they live. And so some people, no matter what country they live in, might think, oh, it's un-American, or I'm not being a good Australian citizen if I put some assets in another jurisdiction. And it's like, no, that's just being wise, because governments oftentimes make foolish decisions. And we should not, I'm really glad you brought that up, that I think it's vital that we diversify not only in different asset classes, but also different countries and jurisdictions. So thank you for sharing that, Graham.
Well, you look at what happened in your country. Go back in 1933 when Roosevelt basically outlawed the private ownership of gold in America and forcibly acquired it at a set price. Those that held their gold outside of America were safe.
Everyone who turned theirs in lost 25% in 3 months of their wealth.
Sorry? What was that?
Everyone who willingly complied and turned in their gold lost 25% of that purchasing power in 3 months.
Well, America revalued it once they had it.
Went from 25 to 33.
Yeah. So you look at those that held their metal outside of America, international diversification. They were safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually talked about that in my second book, Graham, about gold and silver, that only about 20% of Americans complied with that national edict, and those who didn't really did well as well. But yeah, that just shows you that's happened in multiple other countries, that it's wise to hold things in other places.
Absolutely. And you go back to the Holocaust, you go back to World War II and look at those that had metal held outside their country. They could convince the officers, some of them could, convince the officers to get them and their families safe passage to Switzerland, and they could cross their palm with silver and gold. And some actually bought their liberty that way. Same in Vietnam War. People got out of Vietnam with gold and silver. You look at the Gulf War in, 1990, the Gulf War in Iraq. The SAS troops from Britain that sent their soldiers into that war zone sent them in with a very special money belt that contained gold sovereigns. And their theory was if they got caught behind enemy lines, they would be able to bribe their way out with gold coins to get themselves a passage to freedom. And so we've seen time and time and time again throughout history the benefits of international diversification. And I think it's something we ought to use. And some of the big multinational companies use it, and I'm not opposed to it at all. I think if you can, you should, but it's something that's easily available to mums and dads and individuals. And we offer it to our clients where they can store metal outside of the country they live in. And it's a very effective means of accessing another veneer of protection to one's assets to ensure they're there for the next generation.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I wanted to ask you a few last questions, Graham. One thing I got from listening to you, or the way I see it, is you quoted several different teachings and proverbs. And, I love that a lot of people have read Think and Grow Rich. They think the idea of masterminding came from Napoleon Hill, but Solomon wrote about it 3,000 years ago in Ecclesiastes. 2 is better than 1, a quarter of 3 strands is not quickly broken. And, one of the things that I love, he says also, one of the other teachings of Solomon is there's a way that seems right to a man, yet it leads to death. But then conversely, there's another teaching, in a multitude of counselors, wisdom is found. And another verse that says victory is assured. So I want to ask you, how do you ensure you're making the best decisions as you're making business, family, other decisions? And how do you decide who to get counsel from?
Okay. Look, I'm very simplistic in my life. You mentioned earlier that I study ancient Hebrew, and I get a lot of comfort, a lot of guidance from that. Anything I do in my life, I like to be able to back with Torah. Torah being the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. There is so much in Torah. So much about diet, about health, about business, about living a long life, about raising family, about treating animals. There's so much to do with business and lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Anything I do, I like to be able to back with Torah. And quite often you'll see in English versions of the Bible that they translate the word Torah into law. Mm-hmm. Very, very bad translation. Torah means teaching. That's what it means. And so whatever I do in business or lifestyle, I like to be able to back with Torah. That's my first port of call. And so in a multitude of counsellors, yes, there are a multitude of counsellors involved in the Tanakh, which is what the Westerners call the Old Testament. I think another principle that I use, apart from establishing a passage, or if you like, a principle in Torah, is in making a decision, quite often in retrospect, we're smart. And so I project myself to later in life. And if I'm confronted with a situation where I need to make a decision and I don't quite know what is the correct decision, I picture myself as an old man sitting by the fire, my great-grandkids coming in to sit on my knee and saying, "Granddad, back in the year 2019, when you were confronted with that issue that you had to make a very, very difficult decision, how did you make the decision? Which way did you go at that fork in the road?" And the answer I want to tell my great-grandkids at that point is what I should be living in that decision. Mm. And it's something that's worked very well for me because we're all smart in retrospect. So be retrospective. Put yourself in that position. Now I've got this hard decision to make. What way do I go? What decision do I want? What's integrity? What's desperate? What's pushing me in one direction or the other? But the answer I want to give to my great-grandkids of how I dealt with that situation and answered that difficult time in my life is what I should be doing. And I found it to be most valuable. So 2 things. One, the retrospective situation, and the other is finding in Torah the very issues that help me in teaching me how to live my life on earth.
Wow, that's excellent. Yeah, I actually want to start learning Hebrew so that I just got the Blue Letter Bible app where you can look at any verse and then go into the Hebrew word for each word and go deeper on the meaning. And there's so much that's lost in the translation, or sometimes there's so much deeper meaning if you go to the original language. So
absolutely. And the ancient Hebrew is a pictographic font. It changed to the square fonts around the time of the exile to Babylon. Still a 22-letter alphabet, but if you go back to the original pictographic fonts, the meanings are so incredible as far as lifestyle teaching, things we need to know in order to live a better life, a better understanding of nature and nature's God. It's just, it's probably, I would say, is the most valuable education and teaching tool I have found in my 62 years of life.
What resource or resources have you found most valuable if someone wanted to go learn more about the ancient Hebrew? Where would you point them, Graham?
Okay, I would look at a guy called Jeff Benner, American, who's very good on this subject. He has done a lot of research on ancient Hebrew. I think he just calls himself Jeff Benner. If you look at him, Ancient Hebrew Research Center, I think is the organisation he heads up. I am not so keen on many of the teachings of the rabbis because they rely heavily on the oral law. And I'm not a great fan of religious institutions, whether they be Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. I think that when God revealed himself to man, he did that for a purpose. He didn't reveal himself to an institution. And I think institutions have a lot to answer for in distorting the truth. So if you're looking at Judaism, I guess I'd have to classify myself more as a Karaite Jew. If that was a relevant description, Karaite simply means straight. One of the greatest teachers I've found on who is a Karaite Jew is a gentleman called Nehemiah Gordon. We would pronounce it Nehemiah, but Nehemiah, his teachings are phenomenal. But those two resources alone, people would find enormous benefit in. And just trying, and I find it difficult, I've got to be honest, I find it difficult learning the ancient Hebrew, but I persist with it because of what I get out of it. And I've told people in many walks of life that one thing they need to realise is that the meaning of anything can be found in its origin. The meaning of anything. And so keep digging back, looking for the original. And quite frankly, when you dig deep enough, you end up at Torah as the original. And so many of the modern religions today are just that. Islam has only been around since 600 AD. It's a modern religion. But you look at so many of the other religions, they're so modern. So keep digging, go back to the original, and you end up with Torah. And so it's not surprising that we can find the meaning of life within those words.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So it was Jeff Banner, Banner?
Benner.
Oh, BE, thank you. That's the Ancient Hebrew Research Center and Nehemiah Gordon. Thank you for sharing those resources.
Nehemiah Gordon. Yeah.
Sorry, I was saying it the Western way. Yeah, Nehemiah for the Hebrew way of saying it.
Yeah.
So let's have a questions. So you and your father do consultations with people. A lot of business people end up taking you wisely on your consultative services. And one thing I found really fascinating is that you guys desire to influence, I believe it was 30 billion plus was your dad's vision of charitable giving. And so I was curious, when you see, what are the main things that you think people do wrong when they're giving to charity? And how can people ensure their giving produces the most benefits? Because some people, Forbes now is like listing who gave the most money. And I don't think that's the best. I'm not slamming Forbes. I don't think that could be the optimal motivation to give. So there's a lot of discussion amongst people with assets. How do we produce the biggest social ROI with our giving? So I think that's a better way to ask it. What's the best way to optimize the results of your giving?
Okay.
Because you and your dad are very impact focused, I think.
Yeah. A couple of things. One is that we are put in the position we're in geographically and intellectually and emotionally and socially for a reason. And I think we've got to be able to help people where we are. I think it's so much more beneficial and so much more expedient to be able to give firsthand, not to institutions. Now, I'm not saying that all institutions are corrupt. Some definitely are. Some are very inefficient. So in giving $1 to a cause, you might find that only 40 cents gets to the cause. The other 60 cents stays with the administration to those who don't need it.
Right.
And so that's not an unusual scenario. So I favour giving directly, and it doesn't have to be in a big way. It can be in a small way, but giving directly, because you and I know people in our own society and environment that need help. I think that's such a great way to help them, is just to give them either a handout or a hand up, sometimes both. Mm-hmm. Giving to institutions, you've lost some control at that point of knowing that you've actually helped someone. I'll give you the classic example. One of the gentlemen I used to play polo with going back 15, 20 years ago, he was invited to go to Kenya to play polo, which he did. He came back and he said, Graham, I'll never ever be giving to that charitable organisation again, and he named it. I said, why? He said, do you realise that the goods that were sent, and he was talking about food items, bags of flour and so on, they were for sale in the local market. They never got to the poor people. I saw them with the stamp of the organisation in the local market where someone had intercepted it, either government or the organisation, and was selling it to raise money, and then those bags of wheat never ever got to the poor people who needed it. Now, once you send $1 to an institution, you've got no way of knowing where that dollar went. We had similar experiences with one of the churches I went to many years ago, where we were supporting someone overseas until a delegation went to look at the work that he was doing, and he was taking the money and building his own hotel. So, again, we know people in our own walks of life. You know people, I know people who need help. I'll give you a little example of something we did many years ago at this time of year. Christmas, for whatever reason, people celebrate, and I accept that it may not be for the right reasons, but let's say it's a very good time at the end of the year to get together with family and enjoy life and reflect on various issues, both civil and religious. In our experience many years ago, we realised that our family didn't need anything. We don't need gifts and presents at Christmas. So what I suggested was, why don't we look at the money we would normally spend buying gifts and presents for each other, take that money and put it in an envelope and give it to someone who really needs it, because we don't.
Right.
And so I started that off many years ago, and what we did is let's say it's $1,000, put $100 in an envelope, collect them up and give them to someone in the community, and in this case it was the lady in the little country town post office, because she knew who came into the post office, she knew who was doing it rough. I said, here, this is anonymous. I want you to give it, told her what was in the envelopes, give it to the people you think need it this year. And don't tell them where it came from. Mm-hmm. Now, that's direct giving. Because those people, and some of the messages and the letters we got back from people, dear Mr. Anonymous, or dear Mrs. Anonymous, thank you so much. You don't know what it meant just to have that little bit of extra money to put food on the table for my family at Christmas. That's giving. That's charitable work. That's directly helping people that need help. And doing it anonymously, even better. And so I encourage people to give. I think it's very important. I encourage them to do it anonymously. And I discourage religious institutions as a recipient of charities. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they're all of that ilk. There are some very good ones out there. Finding the good ones might be a challenge. But as far as charitable giving, it needs to be part of our day-to-day life.
Yeah, I like, there's an organization that I think in the last 5 years they started in the U.S., and they basically externally audit the administration of nonprofits. And so if someone says we only spend 15% on overhead, this external group actually audits them. And I'm glad to see that trend, because I think that will hopefully help more nonprofit groups be more efficient with their overhead and be able to produce more good with the funds. Because like me, when there was the big typhoons in the Philippines, when Anderson Cooper was there in the Philippines 7 years ago, I was sending money directly to pastors I knew in the Philippines that were meeting the needs of their church mates, and other Americans giving to the American Red Cross. Only 20 cents on the dollar gets to them because there's such overhead. And so there's nothing against the people who are giving to the Red Cross because they didn't know people there. But like you said, if you know someone directly, that's always the way to go.
Look, and I think that there's ways of giving that can perpetuate themselves. For example, in Vanuatu, I lived in Vanuatu for a number of years. We did some work there with one of the local villages where we brought in sewing machines, and flew in a seamstress from Australia and taught some of the ladies in the village how to make uniforms and clothing so that they could then sell those uniforms and clothing and be self-sufficient. We ended up putting a bore in one of the villages for fresh water, and when a flood came through, the whole village pumped out of that bore because of the contamination of the other water supplies. Doing things that help people to help themselves is also very important, because there's so many people out there that are looking for handouts, and you'll have to give them a handout again next year and the year after and the year after, because they never ever grow. One of the things that staggers me, and my father and I talk about this often, we have unemployment benefits in Australia, and we're now breeding second and third generation of people who believe it is their right, it's their entitlement to get handouts from the government. And one of the things that really staggers my father and I is that many of these people that live in government housing, and it's a modest 2-bedroom house with a small backyard in a not a very nice area, but it's housing. Inevitably, all the backyards are full of weeds. And Dad and I have said, why don't they get off their backside, get a spade and a hose, and grow their own vegetables to feed their family? Mm-hmm. They can do that, but they choose not to. And so I think we need to be very careful that we're not giving to a big black hole that's always going to be a big black hole. But we back a winner, not a loser. And then by backing the winner can be in a position where they can back a winner.
That's part of why I love microfinance. It's like giving a poor person a small loan, much like you guys did in Vanuatu, to help someone create a small business. And
yes.
I work with one of the biggest microfinance groups in the Philippines. But what's really neat about them is I think they do almost 60,000 microloans a year. 200,000 microloans a year. They have about a $50 million fund. But then to see a lot more of their kids going to school, they have housing after people get to a certain level. They grow with the person, and it promotes. They have weekly meetings of all of they don't call them borrowers, they call them partners, and how they get to help each other, mastermind, and help each other with business challenges, and also just encourage each other to do better. So, and they also have a weekly Bible study at their partner meetings. And what I love is their reputation is so good in the community that the Muslims in the southern Philippines would rather get a loan from them and go to a weekly Bible study than get a microloan from the bank. Because after Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize, a lot of banks created microfinance divisions. So it just goes to show if you do your work with excellence, it can have a ripple effect. So that's great that you guys are doing that, Graham. It's awesome. Last question. We talked about family and affirming your children and we all have our own individual fingerprints and being their own person. What are your personal legacy goals? It could be even for 3-4 generations for the Daniels family, and then say it's your great grandchildren, God willing, they get to meet you. What do you want to be remembered for when you think 3-4 generations ahead for the Daniels family?
I think if I was remembered for my emphasis on functional family, that would be fantastic. Again, as the family goes, so goes the nation. So by having a functional family, you're actually part of the solution, not part of the problem. I think that if I was remembered for that, and also remembered for the balance of a life between business and lifestyle. So often people will spend so much on business they neglect lifestyle and neglect family, or they go the other way and spend so much on lifestyle that they're broke. Mm-hmm. I think we need to have a balance, and one of the little captions that helps define me is a business and lifestyle advocate, because I think you can do both, and you can do both very well. And so if I'm remembered for that, I think that would be fantastic. Sure, there's other areas that I'm involved with gold and silver, and we're currently in the process of setting up what will be, for better description, a bullion bank, where people can actually hold bullion and trade it in payment of accounts. That would be nice, but to me, it doesn't trump the family. The family's it.
So my stepdad was a workaholic, and I found that I basically had to schedule 7 to 9:30 as family time. And at first, I felt guilty, but I realized if I have to schedule it and it gets done, it got done. Praise God. How do you do it personally? It's always good. I love hearing how other people strategize. How do you integrate and have the holistic family and business?
Well, again, it's lifestyle, David. It's lifestyle. I'm working here from home. I've never really worked I've never worked in a 9 to 5. Never have. I've always been commission selling as a young man, or working my own business as building maintenance or whatever. I've never had a 9 to 5. And even now, you got to practice what you preach. And family's first. I'm sitting in a room here in the home in the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. My horses are out there, my dogs are downstairs, my wife's in the next room, I've got a pool out there. But this is where I work, this is where I live, but family's first. And sometimes if I don't get done what I need to get done during the day because I'm going swimming with my kids or whatever, I stay up at night and do it when they're in bed. But it's. I guess I'm fortunate that I have a job where I can do that. There are other demands on my life at the moment with illness in the family, and so I spend quite a bit of time assisting in that regard. But again, that's a priority. And sure, if I was to concentrate more on my business, it could become far more profitable. But how much is enough? And what's really important in life? Mm-hmm. If family's where it's at, then you've got to be able to practice what you preach. Otherwise, it's just rhetoric. And so, yeah, I'm comfortable. I can work when I need to. I can build business when I need to. I can take on more clients as opportunity presents. But I can't let that get in the way of family.
Yeah, that's great. That will be a great legacy to be known for. I oftentimes remind clients, like one of Solomon's teachings that helped me a lot is, don't wear yourself out to get rich. Have the wisdom to show restraint. And, have no consideration for riches that can fly off to the sky like an eagle. I was telling someone earlier today, I personally know people who have lost 12 million, 56 million, 120 million, and 1.5 billion. The first three overnight, and the fourth family lost to 1.5 billion, which is about 60% of their total net worth in only 18 months, all because family issues weren't dealt with or other challenges. So, like you said, the values are the most important asset we pass on. Whether you give your kid $1 million or 100,000 or 100 billion, if you don't pass on the values, the money doesn't matter. They're not going to know how to have a good life with it.
Yeah, and it's relative too, David. I mean, you look at someone in America that's unemployed and getting welfare from the state. Their life is far more superior than the back blocks of Egypt, than the back blocks of Philippines. I mean, their life is far more superior. And so even that person, by comparison, and we've got to be able to look at the comparisons, anyone in the back blocks of Philippines would gladly trade places with someone on welfare in America because they wouldn't be able to believe it. How come you're walking around on rugs? You've got carpets on the floor. We don't have any of that just to keep us warm, and you're walking around on them. They'd look at the food that you're getting with food stamps. They'd look at the environment you're living in. Electricity, where does that come from? You turn on a tap and water comes out. I mean, it's all relative. And so wealth is relative. And in the eyes of someone in the back blocks of the Philippines or in the back blocks of Cairo, they can't tell the difference between the wealth of David Newby and the wealth of someone on welfare in America. They can't see it because it's just such an extravagant lifestyle that people live. And so wealth is relative, and that's really the subject of one of my father's books on how to be happy though rich. Wealth is relative.
Yeah, I have about 6 of your dad's books on my bookshelf behind me here. Yeah, I love that one because it's a happy though rich, meaning for many people their wealth inhibits their happiness because, like you said, of the over focus on it, the loss of relationships, the worrying about lose it, etc. So contentment, I think, should be the goal, not a certain number. There is no amount of money that will ever fulfill us. So.
And here's the key, David, of how to measure that from a perspective of if it's worthwhile or not. If you own an asset, that's fine. If the asset owns you, you're in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like there's a really good book called Money, Possessions, and Eternity, and it talked about that very thing, that make sure that your possessions do not end up possessing you. And if they're taking up too much of your mental space and your emotional and your spiritual space, then you should look at adjusting how you interact with them. And sometimes it might be like the rich young ruler. You might need to get rid of a lot of it so that it doesn't possess you. But whatever you need to do to get that right long-term perspective, eternal perspective, what's really important in the long term, then we should do that. So, Graham, thank you so much for sharing with us. You shared a lot of wisdom. I would encourage everyone watching, do get a hold of Graham related to doing consultancy with him and his dad, whether that's international diversification with trusts, working with their bullion bank. Graham, what is the best way for people to reach out to you and get a hold of you and look at being able to work with you and your family?
I think the easiest is to look at the Danel website. It's danel.ch, or they can email me at Graham, Graham, at Danel, danel.ch.
Excellent. If it's a .ch for Switzerland, is that the Switzerland thing?
Confederation Helvetica, yeah, it's Switzerland. It's based in Switzerland, that on the server there.
Wonderful, excellent. Yeah, I a lot of my websites, I'm getting servers different places. I'm internationally diversifying my website, so they're not all on just one server, one place. So that's excellent. Graham at danl.ch, and then the website is danl.ch.
Correct. So Graham at Danel or danl.ch for the web.
Wonderful. We'll put links to both of those in our notes for the interview. So, Graham, thank you so much for your time and sharing. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome, David. You take care.